Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. As we come on the air tonight, all eyes are on the Middle East and two unfolding crises. In Syria, the latest attempt to crush the anti-government uprising may have been the deadliest yet, with hundreds reportedly killed in a bombardment of Syria's third largest city. Tonight, President Obama is calling on Syria's President Assad to step aside and allow a democratic transition to proceed immediately. But today, a UN resolution calling for Assad to leave failed when China and Russia refused to support it. And also in the region tonight, Iran is putting on a show of military force, raising the stakes in its tense standoff with Israel. We've got our team in place from Washington to across the Middle East. We'll start in Cairo with NBC's Ayman Mohideen, who's monitoring the events in inside Syria for us. Ayman, what's the latest?
Good evening, Lester. It was an attack that happened under the cover of darkness, but by daylight, the human toll was apparent for the world to see. Now, because it's hard for journalists to report from inside Syria, we've been relying on footage from activists inside the country to tell this story. But we have to warn our viewers, some of the images are disturbing.
Activists are describing it as the single deadliest day in the 11-month Syrian uprising. A barrage of mortars raining down on the city of Homs, killing more than 200 people. Amateur footage, which we couldn't independently verify, captured the devastation and the horror of the nighttime attack that some are calling a massacre.
If you're trying to move the body from the middle of the street, you get shot out. Last night, we tried to get medication and doctors to the area. Snipers started shooting at us.
Homs has seen some of the most intense fighting between the Syrian military and army defectors. The Syrian government blamed the violence on armed terrorist gangs. It also blamed foreign media for exaggerating the situation inside the city. Video on pro-government TV stations portrayed life as normal. By daylight, thousands defied the risk of continued violence, taking to the streets, praying in unity, and mourning their dead in funerals. Not just in Homs, but across the country. And as Syrians continued to grieve, Russia and China blocked the United Nations resolution that was trying to end the violence. The Syrian opposition says it's not deterred.
The people will continue regardless of what's going on the international stage. People will continue demonstrating.
Stop the killing! Stop the hate!
The deadly episode inside Homs triggered angry demonstrations at Syrian embassies in London, Cairo, Washington, and Australia. And for Syrian protesters who may have been dismayed by the UN's inaction, tonight thousands poured back onto the streets in cities across the country, and a sign their resolve has not been broken.
Lester, a senior opposition leader, tells us that it would be suicide to stop the protests now because the Assad government would seek out and punish anyone that dared to speak out and demonstrated against it in the past 11 months. Lester?
Ayman, thank you. We want to bring in our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, powerful statement from the president in that contentious showdown at the UN. Where do things stand right now?
Lester, this was just a terrible day for the United Nations and for diplomacy. The UN resolution had already been watered down to try to get Russia on board, but Russia said it would still vote no and bring China along with it. And because of the unprecedented levels of the attack, the violence by the regime against the opposition, the U.S., Europe, and the Arab League all decided to call Russia's bluff. This was unprecedented and force a vote anyway. Afterwards, U.S. Ambassador Susan Rice delivered a withering response. She said the United States was, quote, disgusted by Russia's veto.
For months, this council has been held hostage by a couple members. These members stand behind empty arguments and individual interests. This intransigence is even more shameful when you consider that at least one of these members continues to deliver weapons to Assad.
Earlier in the day in Munich, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had a very tough meeting with her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, who said that the resolution would have amounted to taking sides in a civil war. The fear now, though, is that the UN's failure to act is only going to encourage Assad to be even more brutal, knowing Russia is going to try to help him stay in power. Tonight, U.S. officials say there is no plan for the U.S. to go it alone, to intervene on its own, not without the stamp of approval from the United Nations. Lester?
Andrea Mitchell, thanks.
Syrian troops backed by tanks and heavy ammunition have reportedly regained control over the outskirts of Damascus. Activists suggest over 60 people have been killed in the latest fighting, just over a day after the Arab League mission was frozen. RT Sarah Firth reports from the Syrian capital.
Well, a sense really that this decision to halt the mission was going to inflame an already extremely volatile situation, and unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen happen. Now, the Foreign Minister Lavrov was speaking on his tour of Asia-specific countries, and what he said about it was that he didn't really understand why such a useful tool was used in this way. Now, we've seen the observer mission stutter and eventually ground to a halt. They never really recovered after that decision last week for the Gulf states when they withdrew their monitors. Now, their decision, they said, was because they felt the mission had failed to hold the Syrian government to its pledge to end the violence. And it was a surprising decision. That's how the foreign minister described it, because at exactly the same time that the Gulf states made that decision, the decision had also been made to extend the mission. And now what was interesting was when that decision was made for the Gulf states to withdraw their monitors, one of the observers I was speaking to had hinted that perhaps the rest of them would follow. And it seems really now, with them having their mission halted, that this is possibly what's going to happen. We've got the meeting coming up on Tuesday where the Arab League are going to be presenting their findings, essentially briefing the UN. Moscow's remains very, very adamant that it's not going to back any plan that's going to leave the door open to foreign military intervention. In fact, again, their response to Western calls now that have said that it's impossible to hold dialogue with the regime here, the Foreign Minister called very irresponsible and indeed unforgivable. And certainly there's a real sense that this Arab League was the one opportunity really to pursue the resolution through dialogue. There's a lot of people here saying, what was the point in having them here in the first place if they weren't going to be made strengthened, if they weren't going to try and work towards dialogue, and if all roads essentially were going to lead to UN action anyway. You've got Harasti, you've got Duna, you've got Arbin, all these areas around the capital that have seen increasing conflict, and there were really serious reports about the violence happening in those areas, and very, very concerning, because the area where we were, Sakba, you've got a huge number of civilian people still on the ground there whose lives are now in very, very serious danger with this escalating situation.